I've chosen to put two women on the shelf that I have endowed, if that's the word. Ada Lovelace, who I think is probably quite well known as a very early theoretical mathematician and the inventor of computer programming. And the second woman may be less well known, but is a personal heroine of mine, Victoria Drummond. She was a Scotswoman who became the first woman to become a ship's engineer in the British Merchant Navy, and she's a heroine of mine because many years after she retired, I became a deck officer in the Merchant Navy, and I was one of the first to do that. When Glasgow Women's Library was in one of its previous premises, I became interested in the history of women in science and engineering, and the first place I came was to the Glasgow Women's Library, and I discovered that although they had lots of books and archives about women doing everything else, they had nothing about women in science and engineering. And this is something I think was a bit of a gap in their collection, which is why I wanted to endow the shelf. If anybody's thinking that they might like to dedicate a shelf, sponsor it, I think this is a great way to promote either a woman who you think is not as well known as she might be for some reason, or even to develop a part of the collection that you think is underrepresented in the library. I think it's a great way to promote particular interests that you might have about women in general.
Lynette's my woman on the shelf because she is a feminist, first and foremost. She's an educator, and she's also a very close friend that I'm happy to say I'm still working alongside. I met Lynette when I was 24 years old, and she was my first full-time manager in youth work. What was interesting about having a manager like Lynette was that she'd probably say she managed you, but you felt as if she was developing you. So you were always learning new things, you were always experiencing the work in a different way. And as she went through her own career, she finally ended up working as a tutor for community development at Glasgow Uni, and she retired from there, and that's why we decided to buy a shelf at Glasgow Women's Library. What's been nice about it is they've chosen to give her the education section. Where she worked in a university, the education that she gave to the community I think is much more lifelong. Glasgow Women's Library is such a feminist institution, and it just seemed right that Lynette would be immortalised within Glasgow Women's Library, but also not just Lynette, but also her approach. And I think that what Lynette done in her education is very similar to Glasgow Women's Library in that way, that it's about developing the person. It's not about developing the person necessarily to provide a service or to be a particular type of role. It's about that person themselves developing, and I think Lynette's name belongs in the Women's Library because it's a very similar approach. I think for too long women have been missing from history, and we're getting better at looking at people like Mary Barber from the rent strikes, and we're getting better at recognising women in quite official positions. I think what the Women's Library offers is an opportunity to remember those women who have developed our communities in that traditional feminist way, where they're flying under the radar but influencing so much. When they're thinking about who they would want to put on the shelf, is to really think about who is that person in your community that makes the difference. Who's the person in your family that makes the difference, and what is that difference? The thing about women on the shelf is it's not just about remembering the individual women on the shelf, it's about remembering how our communities develop. I would urge anybody that knows any woman who's made a huge contribution to their community to consider reminding the future that they actually were here and of the work that they've done.
The woman to whom I want to dedicate a shelf is called Rosella Hightower. She was actually one of 5 Native American women who developed a career in ballet in the 1940s and 1950s, but she was, I think, the one who had the most recognition on the international stage. I first learned about her in a comic that I was reading for girls as a 13, 14-year-old. The comic had a special feature. Every so often they would have a feature of women who had done something and made something of themselves, obviously designed to make girls like me think, well, I could be like her. two main things that struck me about her was that when she was developing career as a ballerina in New York, she was invited by the director of a Paris ballet company. So she spent her entire savings to get the boat trip to go to Paris. And when she was there, she discovered that she'd only been invited for an audition. She hadn't actually been given a job. So everything depended on her passing the audition, otherwise she would have no money to get back to the United States. So fortunately she impressed the judges and she was able to remain with the company. Again, another aspect of her meeting challenges head on was when the famous ballerina Alicia Markova became ill and was unable to dance a particular role. Rosella Hightower was invited to do that. She had never danced this particular role, but she practiced and learned for 5 hours and then performed the role in the theatre. The reviews of her were very positive. She danced to great acclaim. She made her residence in Paris, and at the end of her life she was awarded the French Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur, which is their highest award. So having met her almost at the early stages of my life, I then attended a film at the GFT which was looking at the work of a ballet company. I saw her interviewed when she was a lady of 80, talking about her life, and it was just seeing her almost at the beginning of my life and at the beginning of her life, seeing this lady who was still elegant and refined and so distinguished. And it was almost like kind of, for me, closing the circle of her life. The more people who can dedicate a shelf, nominate an important woman and have that name actually printed for other people to read about is important. And I also hope that one day we'll be able to print some kind of booklet or guidebook that would have the names of all the women and a little paragraph about each woman so that we would all know about all the women who deserve more recognition and respect.
I certainly felt like I wanted to put a woman on the shelf. It was quite a challenge, I think, to decide who that might be, because certainly I've got women in my own family that I would have nominated there and a host of women who have changed the course of history as well in the public eye. But in the end, I decided to sponsor a shelf and dedicate it to the artist Joan Eardley, whose work I love, who died very prematurely and whose work I think and whose life I think needs more recognition, and I'm really proud that Joan is one of our women on the shelf.
I think Glasgow Women's Library is really important because it has such a wide range of resources in such depth that you probably wouldn't find some of these resources anywhere in this country, perhaps not even in the British Library. I know that some of the items I've given will not be in the British Library.
The Women's Library not only provides women with that opportunity to find out more about the history of women, but also provides a place where women can come together to create the new history.
I have always felt that women, they need a space of their own. I think there are so many areas of public life where men and women are together, and very often women have to jostle for a space, whether it's space on the underground or even space in a library.
There's so many different services, including supporting women with their literacy. How do you access your history if you're struggling with your literacy or you're embarrassed about that or your confidence is low? So it not only provides things for people to research and to develop further in wider ways, but also allows individual women to come in to explore some of that history, and also for it to be confirmed that they're right, that things don't feel right, and just to exchange those ideas and thoughts.
We haven't reached anywhere near the kind of targets that we would like to have regarding women's place in society. So a place where they can come and just, whether they want to borrow books, read, meet other women, attend events that are also held by women for women, I think is very important.
Women's Library being here is not only a statement saying that women's history matters, but also in its own right. It's almost like a piece of artwork in its own right as well, and it helps you to engage in sometimes different ways as to what you ever have engaged education.
Many other places which had women's archives have had to close because of lack of funding, and I understand that Glasgow Women's Library over the years have been able to acquire or buy other valuable archives that other libraries have not been able to stock. So I look forward to the day when Glasgow Women's Library would be a kind of the national library of women for Scotland.
Anybody who's interested in women or researching about women, or people who want a women-only space, this is a unique resource. We're very lucky.
Glasgow Women's Library opens up the world for women, I think.
I see Women on the Shelf as one of our most important fundraising initiatives. It not only raises money towards the renovations in our beautiful new building, but it also marks women as a living memorial, and that's really important as well. We came up with the idea because we needed to raise funds towards the capital build. We had already secured investment from some major funders, for which we were very grateful, but we knew that we needed to bring money to the table ourselves and to also demonstrate the level of ownership and support that amongst our thousands of users and supporters would demonstrate how they feel in terms of the importance of Glasgow Women's Library to their lives. So we came up with the idea of Women on the Shelf as a way of them marking special women in their lives. So some people, men and women, who invested in Women on the Shelf, either to sponsor a shelf or a section, or indeed a book, they decided to go for a real range of women to celebrate. Some of them were pioneering women, famous women from the past, or current famous women who really made a difference in life and changed the course of history, but also people went for people important to them in their own families, maybe the grandmothers, their mothers, their daughters, the sisters, and the dedications are really poignant and really moving, actually, really moving testimonies of why they wanted to dedicate a shelf or a section to those women. So it really means a lot to us, and it really means a lot to the people that have invested in Women on the Shelf. And as I say, the other thing is that it builds a living memorial to women, so that we remember women in history, whether or not that's a great aunt or a woman pioneer. Each are important in their own way, and we would love more people to invest in Women on the Shelf. There's still lots of money that we need to raise to complete the building, so at this time more than ever we need support for Women on the Shelf. There are still many shelves to sponsor, so help fill the gaps and put your woman on the shelf.